Thank you.
Yeah, happy birthday.
Yeah.
Thank you.
2, 1. Hey, today we are debating whether or not Matthew predates Mark, and we're starting right now. So, very glad to have you here, everybody. We are having two gentlemen on who are both intelligent and friendly, and I think you are going to enjoy this so much because not only do they bring the friendliness and the intelligence, but as you will see in our tale of the tape that I am showing right now, they have both got some spunk and attitude. So by that I mean, the debaters will see this in a second, they haven't seen it before, but they've seen a version of it. This is, all of it's true except for the quotes that I put in there. I made those up. But the rest of it, for example, their years of relevant study, Jonathan Sheffield has 21 years of relevant study. Jim Majors has 17. Each of them have had 4 debates. And of course, Jonathan is a Christian, Jim is an atheist. And 42 and 31 for their age. And their quotes, which they chose, and they said, James, you have to make sure you put this quote in the tail of the tape. Jonathan Sheffield says, can you smell what the chef is cooking? And Jim Majors says, welcome to the Majors, kid. So we are glad to have both of them. Like I said, I totally made those quotes up. And they didn't know about it until now. So thanks for your patience, guys. We are basically glad to have all of you here. We're going to quick introduce everybody. But first, just want to go over a couple of like house cleaning type things. So quickly, we do have a debate coming up that we're excited about. It's Inspiring Philosophy has been a huge supporter of the channel. We appreciate his kindness, and he is also going to be debating another person who's been a huge supporter of the channel, and that is none other than Tom Jump. I stole that picture from his Facebook. So we are excited. Look at how happy Tom is. He's a lovable guy. They're both lovable guys. Mike Jones from Inspiring Philosophy is coming to debate Tom Jones on the existence of God. So we're pumped for that. It's going to be great. Also, tomorrow, controversial much, we have a debate on whether or not slavery in the Old Testament was ethical or not. So that is going to have 2 different debaters, 2 of which not here tonight, and also not Inspiring Philosophy or our good friend Tom, but one of which you have never seen before, and he's got some spunk, and we'll leave it at that. For our debate tonight, I want to introduce the debaters. I'm going to give them a quick chance to introduce themselves. Their links are in the description. I highly encourage you to check out their links. Even if you're like, man, the Jim Majors just drives me nuts. You can check out his link, and you're going to find out, you're going to be like, wow, you know what, I actually like him. He really grew on me. So,
or you might still hate me.
It's possible. So, no, Jim, you're just this lovable guy. So you're going to find out you love both these guys, especially when you listen to this debate, because they've been on before. This is round 2 for them in a way. And the first one just blew everybody's doors off, knocked my socks off. For these gentlemen, they're going to just give an introduction, like 30, 60 seconds of what's going on at their channel or organization. And then we're going to just kind of have them explain in 1 minute right after that why they think that this question tonight is especially important. Because a lot of people are maybe new to this and they're like, oh, I don't know why it is important. They're going to tell you. So, Jonathan Sheffield, thanks for coming on again. Glad to have you here. If you want to share about what you've been up to, we're all ears. Thanks for coming.
Okay, thank you for having me on your show, James, and thanks again, Mr. Majors, for having this discussion with me. I think it's very value added from both sides. And in regards to my channel, I just recently recreated the first part of my debate with Dr. Richard Carrier. On my channel, for the last 2 years, I have created cartoon animations dedicated to understanding how we got the books of the Testament, discussing such major variants as women in adultery and the last 12 verses of Mark. So definitely come check me out there if you want to see some of those cartoon animations.
Absolutely, especially if you're an Indiana Jones fan, you got to make it over there. We're excited about both of these gentlemen being here. They are, you could say, seasoned veterans. So, Jim Majors, glad to have you here as well. Thanks for coming back. And if you want to share about what you've been up to, we are all ears.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me again, James. Jonathan, it's a pleasure as always to have discussions with you. I had a great one last time. Over at atheistrepublic.com right now, we're working on our next big project, which is Atheist Day, coming up March 23rd. You can go to atheistday.org to check out that event, what it's all about, what we're all about. Basically, it's just atheists and atheist allies standing up for those atheists that can't stand up for themselves, saying, we're here, we're united, we need to be normalized. And that's what our big focus is on right now.
You betcha. Well, glad to have you here, Jim, and exciting stuff for you as well. So with that, before we go into why this question is important, I can't skip her. And don't worry, I'm about to update the border. I just found out late today that she'd be able to come on and co-mod. And she is the most helpful person. She's been so kind to give up her time to come on and just kind of help things keep running smooth. And sometimes we kind of basically, I like Civ, just take the wheel, what's it called on a boat?
The helm?
The helm. Take the helm, Civ, and I'm have to fix something with tech stuff or whatever. And so we're thankful to have her here. Civ, what have you been up to lately? Her link is in the description as well as of 30 seconds from now, because I'm a little bit behind. So Civ, if you want to share what you've been up to, we're glad you're here.
I've just been working on school and messing around on Twitter, and that's about it. I'm really happy to be here.
Thanks, Civ. It's always our pleasure to have you. So with that, gentlemen, if you want to explain, we'll give each guy roughly a minute. This isn't timed or anything, to share about why this question tonight is especially important, and then we will jump right into it. Given that Jonathan Sheffield will be answering yes to the question, we will let Jonathan explain first why our question of tonight's debate question is so important.
Okay, well, thank you, James. Well, the reason why this question is important, because if Mark is first, and in the last 12 verses were added onto it, and then Matthew and Luke are later redactions from the copy of Mark, and then what we see in the Gospel of John is theological development. We have here is an evolutionary development text, which actually undermines the reliability of our New Testament documents, because it shows that it was a theological incentive or agenda behind the creation of this text, which would then in turn undermine the reliability of what its context had to share.
You bet. Thank you very much, Jonathan. And how about you, Jim? Your take on it?
I just think it's important for anybody out there who thinks that the Bible is important, whether they're studying it from an atheistic, agnostic, or a theistic standpoint. Just somebody wanting to know the truth about the Bible. This is one of the very fundamental things that whenever you're formulating your exegesis of who Jesus was, or what about the New Testament, or really about many of the most important events in the Bible. One of the first things that we come to is that Mark was the first gospel to be written, and a lot of biblical scholarship is founded on that. And but I think it's important to see how something that can be held in traditionally can most certainly be false.
You bet. Well, we're glad to get it on. So here we go. All that smack talk and the tail of the tape is about to come real. So I'm setting the timer for 12 minutes. We're going to have a 12-minute opening from Jonathan, who's taking the affirmative, and then we'll have a 12-minute from Jim Majors, and then we will move into rebuttals. And of course, we'll have Q&A at the end. So if you have a question, feel free to put @moderndaydebate at the start of your comment in the live chat, and then just let me know who it's for, and then I will ask that question to one of the speakers. And also, if you're new here, feel free to hit that subscribe button. We're glad you're here, no matter what view you are, no matter you Christian, atheist, all the different varieties of different worldviews out there. Thanks for coming here, and we hope to see you again. With that, I'm going to just start the timer on your first word, Jonathan.
All right, thanks. Okay, in order to answer this question, we actually need to go to history. Now, Chris Hurst, an archaeologist with over 30 years of field experience and author of the Archaeologist's Book of Quotations, who's appeared in Science and Archaeology, actually defines history as a study of the human past as it is described in the written documents left by human beings. And Dr. Richard Carrier, a published author who holds a PhD in ancient history, also conveys the same sentiment when he states, the Aeneid was written in a period of history that is exceptionally well documented. This allows us to understand in good detail the context of the Aeneid's formation. Now, given the focus of this inquiry, we need to consider the following factors before beginning our investigation. First, we are dealing with the formation of a physical document that was published in the ancient world in the face and power of the Roman Empire. So the object of our inquiry is actually a historical artifact, which is a text. Second, the text of Mark, according to Irenaeus and Tertullian, was publicly read to the congregations in the Apostolic Greek, Aramaic, Coptic, and other ancient churches, which formed an integral part of the canonical scriptures. So the text, at some point in history, was handed over to the churches, and the leaders of those churches came in possession of the text. Third, we can identify the physical locations of these churches in the ancient world, like Rome, Alexandria, North Africa, Carthage, Asia Minor, and Gaul, that witnessed to this text of Mark. So we know where the text was received. Therefore, if we're going to investigate this subject in a historical manner, then we need to examine the ancient writings of those that came in possession of the text and were most acquainted with the publication to understand its historical origins. We must remember, Herodotus was an ancient Greek who lived in the 5th century BC, approached his inquiry on the origins of the Greco-Persian Wars in a very similar fashion. And on this account, the 1st century Roman orator, Cicero, referred to Herodotus as the father of history, because Herodotus is widely considered the first writer to have treated historical subjects using a method of systematic investigation, specifically by collecting his documents and then critically arranging them into a historiographic narrative. Now, Herodotus even tells us in his writings the purpose and scope of his histories is to prevent the traces of human events from being erased by time and to preserve the fame of the important and remarkable achievements produced by both Greeks and non-Greeks. And further on, Herodotus tells us that he is merely reporting what he has been told. Now, ancient Christian historians have approached the task of chronicling its histories in the same manner. Take, for example, the statement from Socrates Scholasticus of Constantinople, who covers the history of ancient Christianity during the years of 305 AD to 439. Now, he tells us in his ecclesiastical history, we therefore propose to write at large the details of what has taken place in the churches, beginning with the relation of those particulars which Eusebius has passed over, and bringing down subsequent events down to our times. Nor shall we be very solicitous to display an empty parade of words, but to lay faithfully before the reader what we have been able to collect from the best authenticated records and such information as has been communicated to us by those who were then identified with the transactions to which they bear testimony. Now, this statement by Socrates not only provides testimony that the churches did keep historical records, but the foundation of his histories was dependent on documentation and testimony of those involved. Now, the same approach and methodology can also be found in the writings of another church historian, Eusebius of Caesarea, who covers the history of the ancient churches from the time of Christ up through the 4th century, ending with a tribute to the Emperor Constantine. Now, Eusebius, who reports specifically on the order and publication of the gospel records, affirms that he draws his information from ancient written documentation of the elders of the churches and historians of the church. Eusebius specifically states, "At the beginning of the work, I promise, when convenient, to quote passages in which the early presbyters and historians of the church have transmitted in writings that which had come down to them regarding the canonical scriptures. One of these was Irenaeus. So without more ado, I will quote his remarks, beginning with those which concern the Holy Gospels." Now, before I present the empirical data, I want to point out that modern scholarship's hypothesis that Mark was the first gospel published, a theory that was only first introduced in 1786 by Goblet Christian Store, has no ancient documentation or writings from members of the church, or a church record, a council, or a historian to document that assertion. Therefore, the statement, "Mark was the first gospel published," is not a historical statement, since it does not meet the measurement of history as I outlined earlier. Now, this school of thought can maintain that any postmodern narrative is as good as another, which is perfectly acceptable in many academic circles, but they can't call their assertion historical. And while we can formulate theories based on empirical data, modern scholarship has no empirical data which forms the basis of the hypothesis that Mark was first. Therefore, it's just conjecture. Now, I want to proceed to the empirical data to provide evidence for Matthean priority. Now, to understand first, it's important to understand the polity of the apostolic churches. That is, how are they set up and organized, which provides the mechanism for them to secure their textual histories. Now, this policy is historically documented in the writings of Irenaeus, Tertullian, Eusebius, and Irenaeus declares that we can enumerate those who were established by the apostles as bishops in their churches and their successors down to our time. Now, Tertullian, on the opposite side of the Roman Empire, confirms this polity in his prescription against heresies, and Irenaeus writes further on in his treatise that he could enumerate the successions of all the churches, but for the sake of brevity, only lists the successions of the Church of Rome. Now, the polity establishes a legal chain of custody for the text, which is essentially the transfer and control procedures that safeguard the text to preserve the evidence. It also establishes the mechanisms to source the text back to the apostles, which gives legitimacy to their claims. This is what Irenaeus means when he states, "We appeal again to that tradition which has come down from the apostles and is guarded by the succession of elders." Now, Irenaeus connects this statement to the history and formation of the gospel testimony. For Irenaeus affirms Matthew among the Hebrews issued a writing of the gospel in their own tongue, while Peter and Paul were preaching the gospel at Rome and founding the church. After their departure, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, also handed down to us writing what Peter had preached. Not only does Irenaeus provide testimony on the order of publication, but he also identifies the who, where it was composed, and a time frame for the event. Now, and what Irenaeus writes next gives greater weight to his argument. For he says, "Similarly, Polycarp, who not only was taught by apostles and associated with many who had seen Christ, but was installed by apostles for Asia as bishop in the church of Smyrna. I saw him myself in my early youth. He always taught what he learned from the apostles, which the church continues to hand on, which the only truth. Churches in Asia all bear witness to this." Now, Irenaeus, who grew up in Asia Minor, is a witness to the testimony that had come down from Paul's churches that was later taken over by John the Apostle. Now, given Irenaeus is just one witness, we need to compare the historical account of other gospel publications from other churches who also trace back to the apostles. Now, the next logical step in our investigation leads us to Alexandria, Egypt, because Eusebius documents in his history that Mark is said to have been the first man to set out for Egypt and preach there the gospel which he himself had written down, and the first to establish churches in Alexandria itself. So if I'm a detective and trying to find out information about the formation of a text claimed to be by Mark, it only makes sense to start with the churches that are most familiar to Mark, therefore Alexandria. Now, Origen, who was at the Church of Alexandria, provides the following testimony. The Gospel, according to Matthew, who was at one time a publican and afterwards an apostle of Jesus Christ, was written first, and that he composed it in the Hebrew tongue and published it for the converts of Judaism. Second written was that according to Mark. Now, Clement, who was also from Alexandria, and Athanasius also confirms the same testimonies in their writing. So we have three independent witnesses from Alexandria, the Church of Mark, who conveys the same testimony. Now, since Irenaeus, Clement, Papias, and Tertullian all placed the publication of Mark's Gospel first at Rome, the next logical point of investigation leads us to the official Church of Peter and Paul, founded at Rome. Now, Jerome, who in his preface to the Gospels addressed the Pope Damascus in 383 AD, stated that this was undoubtedly composed in truth, referring to the New Testament Gospels, with the exception of the work of Matthew the Apostle.
Got about 50 seconds left.
Who was the first to commit to writing the Gospel of Christ and who published his work in Judea in Hebrew characters. And we see the same testimony coming out of Augustine in North Africa, that first it was Matthew who published, then Mark, thirdly Luke, lastly John. So to conclude my opening remarks, the testimony coming down from the churches closest to the apostles in Asia Minor, which is a witness of Paul's and John the Apostle's churches, Alexandria, which Eusebius says was set up by Mark, Rome, Gaul, and North Africa, all basically independently witness to the same testimony, which would be conclusive in any other normal court of law. With this, I succeed my time to Jim.
Thank you very much. Totally appreciated, Jonathan, for that clear opening statement, and we are off and running. So, Jim Majors, same deal. I will start the clock on your first word.
Okay. As usual, Jonathan was pretty much accurate in everything that he said as far as his references to all the early church fathers and the distribution of the text and everything along those lines. But the only problem is that with this external evidence of Matthew being written before Mark, you are depending on, Clement, Clement, Eusebius, Irenaeus, Athanasius, Tertullian, all these early church fathers' accounts all depend on one church father's reference, and that is Papias. But the only problem is, one that Jonathan is overlooking, is that Papias says that Matthew was written in the language of the Hebrew people. It is neither, and to somebody like Papias who wasn't familiar with Aramaic or with Hebrew, they would very much be the same to him. They would look very much the same. They would be indistinguishable. So I will grant that it could be either Hebrew or Aramaic. The only problem is that people who examine the text, myself included, it's very clear to see that the text was originally written in Greek. As a matter of fact, Mark is closer to being of an Aramaic or a Hebrew source than Matthew is, as it contains many more Aramaisms that are corrected later on. So with that being said, since he doesn't give us much to go off of, is the Gospel of Matthew the book that Papias mentions? No. So why do I think that Matthew, or that Mark was written before Matthew? Well, for one, it's the shortest of the Gospels. It lacks many of the stories that Matthew and Luke have, the other synoptics. So the question I would ask is why would Mark have omitted some of these major events? Mark doesn't include the angel visiting Mary to tell her she's going to give birth to Jesus. In fact, Mark doesn't have a birth narrative at all. Mark doesn't say a word of the three magi, Herod's plan, or the flight into Egypt. Um, Much of the Sermon on the Mount that's found in Matthew and Luke are not found in Mark. The Beatitudes, the what I like to call the blessed are these, are not found in Mark. Some of Jesus's most powerful words were in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. When Jesus says that he has come to fulfill the law and the prophecies, and that whomever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. In Matthew 5 and Luke 16, Mark leaves this out. The antitheses of Matthew are left out. The command to turn the other cheek are absent from Mark. The Lord's Prayer is missing from Mark. The way that Jesus himself is said to have taught us to pray is complete and virtually complete in Matthew and Luke. Luke does leave out a few things, but it is completely missing in Mark with just a very vague reference to it. And it's not only missing from Mark, but it varies in placement in Matthew and Luke. In Matthew, it's part of the Sermon on the Mount. It's right there along with the Beatitudes. But in Luke, it has nothing to do with the Sermon on the Mount. It's after Jesus had said a prayer that the disciples asked him how they should pray. And this is another thing that we can look at. Like if the placement was already solidified in the source from Matthew and Luke, then as they are with the rest of the shared stories in Mark, then the placement would have been much more the same chronologically. But with this varied placement in Matthew and Luke, it tells us that the story came from another source altogether, and that didn't explain the placement in time of the story. So that's why you see a lot of variance there, and you see a lot of variance in other stories that are in Matthew and Luke and not Mark, which tells us that the source of the story wasn't very solid in their placement. Let's see what else. The golden rule that we all grew up with, it doesn't exist in Mark. It's in Matthew and Luke, though. If Mark was written after Matthew, why would he omit all of these incredibly important words of the Lord? The events that are documented in regard to commissioning the 12 disciples is problematic. Matthew takes the two separate accounts, one from Mark chapter 3, and one from Luke chapter one from one from Mark chapter 6 and one from Mark chapter 10. No, Mark 3 and Mark 6. I'm sorry, Mark 3 and Mark 6, and they mash them up together in Matthew 10, as if it all happened at once. So he takes two separate events from Mark and smashes them into one in Matthew. With Jesus walking on water, Matthew takes a story from Mark and adds to it. Matthew 14:22. Jesus, when he dismisses the crowds and goes up to pray, this is after the feeding, and the boat's battered and the wind was against the disciples, and the disciples see Jesus through the storm, and Peter asks Jesus, call me, Lord, and he comes out and walks on water, and then he falls, and Jesus picks him up and he says, ye of little faith, and he gets in the boat, and all of a sudden the storm stops, and the disciples say, well, surely you are the Son of God. But that's not exactly how it goes in Mark. Mark's version is much shorter. It includes nothing about Peter sinking, even though Mark is supposedly written by the interpreter of Peter. But it is found later in Mark, and so this shows how later authors took these two different stories and combined them into one, the stilling of the storm and everything like that. And then we have other ways to look at it. We can look at it grammatically, where Mark is more primitive and his grammar is constantly being corrected by Matthew and Luke. So we know that something wouldn't be that grammatical errors wouldn't be put in after the fact. It makes much more sense for them to correct some of his Greek grammatical errors, for Matthew to correct Mark's errors, than it is for Mark to miscopy Matthew purposefully and put in the wrong grammar. Like, for instance, Mark 10:20, it says philaxamine, which means I have kept or I have observed, but that's grammatically incorrect Greek. And Matthew comes along later and fixes it in 1920 to the correct Greek word ephylaxa. And sometimes where Mark and Matthew are the same, where Mark and Matthew are the same, Luke is different. And other times Mark and Luke are the same, but Luke is different. But there are very, very few cases compared to those where Matthew and Luke agree against Mark. And so this is a really good reason to hold to Matthew and Luke as the Mark in priority. It's a big reason why the majority of the biblical scholar community holds to Mark in priority. To hold the Matthean priority is to suggest that all of these were omissions, that Mark instead added that instead of adding these important parts, like the Beatitudes and the Lord's Prayer and all these other important things, that Mark would have added those instead of adding to other stories. For instance, these are just a few of the stories that Mark adds to, where his versions are longer than Matthew's or Luke's. You have the healing of the leper in chapter 1, the calming of the storm in chapter 4, casting demons into the pigs in chapter 5, healing the paralyzed man in chapter 2, the calling of Matthew in chapter 2, the question on fasting in chapter 2, Jairus' daughter in chapter 5, which is long as hell compared to Matthew's account, the parable of the sower, the parable of the mustard seed, the blind man in Bethsaida. There are so many different instances where Matthew could have, being shorter, you would think that it'd be the condensed version, but instead these very seemingly unimportant parables are added to, where the message was put across very well by Matthew and Luke. So we know that Mark is not just a condensed version of Matthew. It's very plain to see that Mark was expounded upon, that Mark was added to. There's a lot of Old Testament references that are in Matthew and Luke that aren't in Mark. A lot of prophetical or seeming prophecies that are brought up through the Old Testament. Yeah, I mean that's really all I have. I mean, I can keep going into it if you want some more examples, but I mean there's really no good reason to believe outside of the external evidence. Once you can admit that Papias, that the document that Papias is referring to is not the Gospel of Matthew, then it's very, very easy to see from there that Mark was very clearly written first. And with that, I succeed my time.
You got it. Well, thank you very much, Jim Majors, as well, for a clear and articulate opening. So we now just want to call your attention to the fact that Civ Weber now has her own name tag. So thanks for your patience on that, Civ. The Civ Weber, Twitter's favorite daughter. Her link for her Twitter is down in the description. All right. So moving into the rebuttals. This is going to be excellent. We have 10 minutes for rebuttals for each speaker. So I'm just excited that this is like high level, like you guys, I don't know, it's almost like we're like able to like put out like lectures and you're getting both sides though, because a lecture, well, sometimes lectures have both sides, but this one especially does. So here we go with 10 minutes on the timer, and I will start on your first word, Jonathan.
Okay, well, thanks again, Jim, for sharing your perspective on that. Let me first start off with the testimony of Papias. I think the first thing we need to understand from Papias is he doesn't contradict what Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Eusebius, or what any of the other fathers said. Now, we know that we do have Aramaic churches who do have Aramaic copies of the Gospel of Matthew. Now, which came first? You know, we have Irenaeus, who says it was written in, I believe, the Aramaic language, which was the language of that area. We do have Aramaic churches who have a copy of Matthew in Aramaic. So, and we also have a Greek copy from the churches as well. Now, Augustine supports that statement from Papias. Jerome supports that statement from Papias, and so does Irenaeus. So we have three independent centers that don't contradict what he says. So when we look at the evidence, and I definitely want to explore a little more about the consensus, because Jim is correct. And Jim is not referring to a liberal, right-leaning majority that is anti-Christian in origin. Jim is actually referring to conservative Christian, mainly mainstream scholarship. There's nothing out of tune with what he's saying. This is an argument that is held in high regard by the Christian conservative majority. Almost all our scholars basically support this position. But in order to understand the scholarly consensus, we must also go back to history to see what was the basis of this consensus. Now, as I pointed out earlier, Christopher Staub was the first one to propose this idea that Mark was first. Now, there's nothing wrong with proposing a hypothesis, but the question is, with a hypothesis, what is the empirical data that you're building this hypothesis off of? And as I've already explained, we have independent testimony that is consistent from Asia Minor, from Rome, North Africa, in Alexandria, the bed places of Christianity, those churches that can trace back to the apostle, churches that were set up and organized in the first century, all independently attest to this same testimony on Matthew priority. There was no agenda. If Mark was first, I don't see any agenda why they wouldn't say Mark was first. But they're reporting what had been come down and was received. And we don't have just one witness, but independent witnesses from the churches of John that Irenaeus represented in Asia Minor. We know who his bishop was. We know who those churches were. We see the same thing in Alexandria, same thing in North Africa, same thing with Eusebius. And remember, Eusebius is reporting on documents. So he's acting in the capacity of an official historian and going to the documents. But Christopher Storr in 1785, what was the empirical data based on? What new evidence did Christopher find to lead him to the conclusion that Mark was first? And this is why I assert that this is not historical, because to be history, it has to be documented. It has to come from documents. Whether it's good documentation or bad, there is no documentation to support this narrative. And what's interesting enough, in this same era, in this school of thought, Breisbach, who was a contemporary of Christopher Storr, actually comes to the opposite conclusion in the late 18th century and actually says Mark was the last gospel published. So we have two scholars coming out of the German school of thought that comes to opposite conclusions, which shows the subjectivity of their hypothesis, which has no empirical foundation on which it rests. Now, when Hort came to the conclusion that the text of the New Testament came into being through a process of a conflation of readings that were formed through a recession at Antioch, he at least had two ancient documents. Being their documents of unknown provenance, he did have at least some empirical documentation to base his hypothesis, even though he was not able to establish his conclusions as actually being historical. But in the case of Mark and priority, there is no document anywhere in history that supports that history. And so such a statement is not found on any historical documentation, but actually conjecture. So the question is, why would we reject actual documentation for a hypothesis which is founded on no documentation? What field of science would we employ that particular research method? Wouldn't those closest to the apostles that actually came in possession of the text, which requires a physical transfer of one hand to another, be able to document and know where they received the text? And because we have not just one independent center of Christianity, but many in Asia Minor, North Africa, in Rome, in Gaul, throughout the Greek Mediterranean, in Alexandria, we see them coming up with the same testimony, document the same consistent results. And what we also see is if Mark was first, then we would naturally presume that we would see a majority of quotations coming from Mark, since it was first published in the writings of the Father. But when we look to the earliest fathers connected to the earliest churches in Antioch, with Ignatius of Antioch, the majority of his quotations come from Matthew, and there's very little to glean from Luke and Mark. The same is found in the writings of Polycarp, who was Bishop of Smyrna, and according to Irenaeus and Tertullian, was placed in there by John the Apostle. The majority of the quotations coming out of Polycarp is Matthew. And the same thing is also found in the Diache, which also dates anywhere between 50 to 150 AD, follows Matthew. So if Mark did come first, why did it not dominate the quotations of the Father due to its early preference? So what we see in this entire understanding or origin of this theory that Mark is first is that it's not based on any real history. And remember, history, as I've documented above, is the study of the human past as is described in the written documents left by human beings. So what this school of thought is providing is not any actual history, but really a postmodern narrative that is not based on any historical foundation. With that, I'll succeed to Mr. Majors.
You bet. Thank you very much, Jonathan Sheffield. We basically we have 20 seconds extra that we can add to the Q&A, so that's excellent, which is a good time to transition into the rebuttal from Jim Majors. Right now, I will start on your first word.
Well, I think it's important to point out that I think that Jonathan is mixing tradition and history. Church tradition has often been proven not to be historical. For instance, you have the Book of Daniel written much later than it was purported to have been written. You have the Pentateuch, which was written much later than it was purported to have been written by somebody that wasn't even traditionally attributed to. It's originally attributed to have been written by Moses, but modern scholars, I would say even more so than those who hold to Markan priority, agree that the Pentateuch was not written by Moses or even by the same person. Jonathan's attempted explanation to explain why Papias is referring to the book of Matthew as being written in the Hebrew tongue, it's really difficult to prove that, because whenever you look at these Aramaic copies, when you look at these Coptic copies, when you look at these Georgian copies, when you look at these copies of Matthew written in these other languages, they don't read as Aramaic or Hebrew. They read as a Greek translation. And whenever you read the original or the oldest Greek manuscripts that we have, they read very much like original original Greek. And like I said before, Mark actually contains more Aramaisms than Matthew does. In fact, Matthew corrects many of the Aramaisms that Mark puts out, with the exception of to Greek, with the exception of like Eli correcting that from the Eloi and using a Hebrew correction instead of a Greek correction. But in instances like that is the only instance that you see it. So I mean, it would have to be a completely different document, because you can't just translate something from Aramaic and get it into Greek like that without severely changing much of the wording. So you would have to first prove that there was something that this was translated from, because tradition is not at all a reliable source, especially when you're referencing historical documentation. So I mean, really, there is no, when we're talking about empirical foundation, there really is no empirical foundation externally, and I would be interested to see Jonathan address some of the internal evidence that I had given for this. He talks about, Eusebius and all these other church fathers who were claiming the order to be of this, to be Matthew, Mark, Luke, and then John. What he's not, and it kind of refutes what he said about the two German scholars who had different agreements. One of them said that Mark was written last. And so, I mean, that just goes to show you, yes, there is a lot of subjectivity in this. I mean, there really needs to be some really hard empirical evidence. And the reason that there hasn't been anybody questioning it up until as late as it was originally questioned was because, nobody was really getting into all of the texts that we have. Nobody had access to all of the texts that we had. Nobody had this many textual variants to examine. Like, what the knowledge that we currently have is greater than the knowledge that anybody else had. We have more variants in manuscripts than any other generation of biblical scholars, and that is I would say that is inarguable. So I would say that we are in a much better position to judge the authenticity and the dating of these texts than people who were 200, 100, 200, 300, 400 years after the fact. Simply because we don't have that gap. We have that 100-year gap where we don't know anything about these autographs. All we know about is church tradition, which we know to be faulty. And in this church tradition, from our earliest church father, from Papias, he tells us it was written in the Hebrew tongue, and which I've already, I believe completely refuted. And if I haven't, I'm happy to provide more evidence for that. And with that, I mean, that's about all I have on that.
You bet. Thanks so much, Jim. And oh, forgive me, just lost the I have the format right before me, and oh, here it is. Okay, thanks for your patience. Okay, that's embarrassing. No, I don't. Okay, give me 1 second. I'm sorry about that. I had it on a notepad. If one of you remembers the next section of time,
yeah, it was the one where you announced me the winner, I believe.
Very good. I like that. Okay, let me see here. It was on the yellow sticky on my MacBook. I'm so sorry, you guys.
No worries, man.
We're gonna get through this. Just 1 second. Got me sweating bullets. Okay. So, in terms of upcoming stuff, we are excited. By the way, I want to mention, because they've given us so much support, it just so happens that Kyle from Non-Sec Show is here. And if you love debates, friends, I want to encourage you, check out the Non-Sec Show, especially their flagship debate is the Flat Earth debate on Saturday nights. I highly encourage you to check them out, especially if you love Flat Earth debates. But they also have debates just like here, namely philosophy of religion, theology, stuff like that. So, and I am looking up, got the format here, so thanks for your patience on that. All right. 20 minutes of cross-examinations broken up into 4 segments of 5 minutes each for each person. So, basically what we'll be doing is 5 minutes from Jonathan Sheffield, grilling Jim Majors, who looks an awful lot like Civ Weber right now. Basically, our pictures swapped. If you haven't seen the monitor, sorry about that, speakers. Jim Majors is the person in the bottom right, I assure you. So we're going to first have Jonathan grill Jim Majors. I'm going to get Jim Majors back in his spot. And then we will have Jim Majors grill Jonathan Sheffield for 5 minutes. And then one more grilling each way before we go in.
Grill Civ.
Yes, that's right. Civ, I'm
All
sorry.
right.
You're the new Jim Majors, so they're going to grill you with tough questions. But okay, so the clock I have set, and on your first word, Jonathan, we will start her up.
Okay. So, Jim, for my first question, why should we reject actual documentation or written documents for a hypothesis that has no empirical documentation? And how would you qualify this as being a scientific approach in your investigation to answer the question?
Sure. Well, I would say that it is scientific in that we're looking at the evidence. We're looking at both internal and external evidence. Personally, I find the internal evidence to be more compelling than the external evidence. So I do believe that external evidence, or the internal evidence, most definitely takes priority in this case. However, I do believe that documentation does play a very important part in the identification of the documents, both the dating and the authenticity. So I'm sorry, I addressed your last question. What was your first one?
I think the first one was, why should we reject actual written documentation? Which...
Oh, okay. Right. Okay, so if you're referring to Irenaeus, to Eusebius, to Tertullian, to Papias, and all the other good stuff, I would say that I would reject Papias being our earliest church father, who is referencing the gospel and what the gospel composes of. He's the one who gives us the earliest list of the gospel, and when he's describing Matthew, he says that it's written in the tongue of the Hebrew, and just off the evidence that I've given, showing that it was not originally written in either Hebrew or Aramaic, I would say that would be a complete reason to dismiss it.
Okay. Now, Irenaeus, Jerome,
yes,
and Augustine also confirmed that it was written in the language of the Hebrew. So
correct.
not only we have one. Now, given we don't have the original document, so it's pretty hard to testify or to validate that position, since we don't have the originals and we only deal with copies that we have down.
Sure.
But why would they be wrong also on the fact that they all said that Matthew was published first?
No, that they could have been very right. There could have been whether it's the Gospel of Matthew or the Gospel of the Hebrews, there are other books out there that could possibly predate Mark. So, I mean, it is completely possible that there is something that is attributed to Matthew out there that was originally written in the Hebrew language that does predate Mark. But what I'm saying is that what is in the churches as we know it does not fit the description of the church fathers.
But would you say that when we investigate the churches, and this is what Irenaeus and Tertullian's focal points are, go to the churches to examine the official writings yourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Would you agree that when we examine the documents that have come down, they are all a witness to the text of Matthew?
Yes, but I will say that the documents that have come down, there's a serious break from where they quote unquote come down from the source to our next known source. Our next known source is correct me if I'm wrong, but about 100 years later. Well, almost. I'm sorry, if we're including Papias, it is decades later.
But wouldn't the churches that are closest to the apostles, that being Alexandria, the church in Rome, the churches in Asia Minor, have a better understanding of their histories than German school of thought in the late 18th century?
No, I would certainly hope so, but given that these other church fathers that came after Papias that we know of, for instance, take Eusebius for example. Eusebius only knows what Papias wrote because Irenaeus wrote it, you know, and Irenaeus only knows about the order of the Gospels because Papias wrote it. So and we don't have any of Papias's original documents, as none of those exist. Even in Eusebius's time, Eusebius tells us that any of the original documents from Papias doesn't exist. And then for you have, you know, Clement, Athanasius, and Tertullian, and all these other church fathers that come hundreds of years after the fact. So I would say that they are very much dependent on people like Irenaeus and Eusebius and Papias to be telling the truth about these things. I don't believe that they get their church history from the churches. They get the church history from other church fathers and other theologians.
How much more time do we got?
Basically 7 seconds.
Oh, okay, no.
one more, go, Jonathan, more.
Excellent. So I'm going to fix our little tech issue. So sorry every time. Okay, so Sivcat, if you want to take us over to the next part, if you got my message, and then I will fix this tech issue right now.
Yes, but what is the next part that we are doing? I'm sorry.
You bet, that's okay. This will be 5 minutes of Jonathan being grilled by Jim Majors with extreme prejudice.
Okay. Just a moment, and I will set the timer.
We've got the pictures back, which is one good thing, and I can't remember who said it in the live chat. We hear it every time. There's one in every crowd that always says they all got raptured whenever we go completely dark. So very funny.
Yeah.
But,
I don't believe in that either. So
all right.
All right. Well, whenever y'all are ready.
Oh, okay. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Okay, I didn't have any questions written down, so that's one thing that I forgot to do. So I'm just gonna kind of wing this. So Jonathan, I guess something that was really crucial to me growing up, you know, were things like, you know, the Lord's Prayer and the Golden Rule. You know, those were staples in my household. And it wasn't until later that I found out that they weren't there, you know, in these other gospels. And so I guess my question to you is why would Mark leave out something that Matthew wrote if like the Lord's Prayer and like the Golden Rule?
yeah, now I think what's important to realize, because there's a lot of things that are left out, and even though not good at reading minds do well from a first century author. The thing is, what we do see coming down is we have 4 independent accounts. And, you know, so when I look at the composition of Mark, obviously it's the shortest of the gospel. And I actually like the Gospel of Mark. It's very short and succinct, and it gets the message right to the point. But, you know, when we look at the testimony from Irenaeus, Pius, Clement, Eusebius, Jerome, and even Augustine, you know, the composition from the historical documents is that Mark is actually recording a summary of the sermons of Peter, who was preaching in Rome. So when we look at that, you know, and anyone that's gone to a sermon, you know, it's a summation. And that's why when we look at the order of Mark, we see that very same approach in the first chapter as we see in the last time. He's moving from event to event to event. And this is very classical of a summation when we're looking at a sermon. Because the sermons aren't meant to be hours upon hours upon hours, but short, succinct summaries that narrate over a declaration of events.
But the only problem is that you have Matthew condensing all of these parables together. And Mark actually has these parables in places that fit it, that are relevant. And Matthew just condenses all of these together in between, chapters 12 and 13. But I mean, you would have to also it has to also concede that the chronology is out of order, because like, take for instance the Lord's Prayer, where it is in Matthew and it's in Luke, but it's in two different places in Matthew and Luke. So it's not just like, Mark was just this crazy condensed thing of stories, and it's possible that things got out of order. But you would also have to explain how, which one is right, which one is chronological. Was it before or after the Sermon on the Mount? And then you would have to go on to explain why Mark, which was written by the interpreter of Peter, would leave out Peter coming out of the boat and walking on water to Jesus.
Well, one thing that we know from history is that if we talk about Matthew and Peter, they were both followers of Christ. So
Right.
They had access to, or they would have had access to very similar pieces of information, as opposed to Mark and Luke, who were scribes of Paul and Peter.
But they were there.
Yeah,
It's not a case of having access to the information. These are both people who were supposedly eyewitnesses to these events.
And
correct.
We have 1 minute left.
Okay. Now, what we're looking at is independent vantage points being communicated. And just like in case law, when police investigate testimony from the scene of the crime,
Right.
what they look for is first that there wasn't collusion. And when you look at the Gospels themselves, it doesn't look like they all came together and it's like, we're going to match this up perfectly, because
I highly disagree. There are 661 verses in Mark, and over 600 of them are in Matthew, almost verbatim. So I would say that they very, very much collaborated.
well, they had the same source. So if they
So
were,
I would call that collaboration.
well, if Peter, but there's a lot of differences in them too. So there are events that are not in there. So they
Sure,
didn't line
but the only differences that are there. I'm sorry. That's it.
That is time. All right, and now, Jonathan, it is your turn to question Jim. I'll start whenever you're ready.
Okay. So, Jim, now, given that Christian Stable and Store didn't first propose this until 1786, what new empirical data did he discover to lead him to formulate his hypothesis that Mark was first?
Well, it's not anything about finding new data, or new evidence. The evidence existed there all along. But if you look at most of textual criticism over history, much of New Testament textual criticism did not even, come along until that era, until hundreds of years later, just because nobody really cared about it. And this is both, even the early church theologians, they didn't really care to get into the hermeneutics of it, or the critical analysis that we get into today. And I think a big part of it is just them not having access to such a variety of text and sources.
Now Jerome was a textual scholar in the 4th century, and
Correct.
from his preface of his gospel translation, he says he had access to many old ancient documents, which was the basis for his revision. And Jerome testifies to a number of variants. So Jerome, who was a textual scholar, he was trained by the Patriarch of Constantinople, Gregory Nazian, in the 4th century. Why would a scholar of his caliber not recognize this issue?
Well, for starters, Jerome being written early on and in an isolated part of where he was, Jerome had limited access to manuscripts. He was being very, very braggadocious when he was talking about his wealth of riches that he had as far as sources go. But we can tell by looking at the Vulgate and other Latin texts, and then looking at other sources that we have from all around the region. from the various different churches and different languages. That he most certainly did not have access to all of these, and in fact, much of there are many cases in the Latin Vulgate where he actually takes the least popular translation or the least popular writing.
Now, if Mark was published first, wouldn't this naturally suggest we would find more quotations from the earliest fathers, since this one came into publication first? Because the documentation from Ignatius of Antioch and Polycarp of Smyrna do not suggest this in their writings at all, but show a majority of their quotations coming from Matthew.
Well, no, not necessarily. You know, Mark is very appealing to a Gentile community. You know, but Matthew and Luke were much more inclusive of Judaism and Judaic practices. It really helped them with their conversion rates. You know, they allowed them to keep a lot of their Jewish customs, and in fact, in many cases, you know, you know, Jesus tells them that he's not going to remove the old law, and you know, and that's absent, you know, from Mark. There's a lot of Judaic references in Matthew and Luke that aren't in Mark, and so that really leads us to believe that they had a problem with conversion, and that while Mark was good for converting a Gentile audience, they really needed something else for converting a Judaic audience who were not so comfortable with abandoning their Judaic traditions.
Now,
we have 1 minute left.
Okay. Now, Griesbach, who was of the same school of thought, argued for an opposite position. I mean, wouldn't you think this shows how subjective their scholarship is, as opposed to the consensus that is received in the apostolic churches?
Sure. Well, and like I said, you know, the consensus in the apostolic churches is very much dependent on church tradition, and church tradition was very much, you know, handed down. But before Papias, we have no reference to these gospels or their authorship. So I mean, you know, 50, 60, 70, 80 years after the fact, we don't know who wrote these, you know, other than the attestations of these early church fathers. And so I think it's best to look at the internal evidence to point us in the direction.
How many seconds do we have left, Steve?
This is time.
Okay.
So now, Jim, it's your turn to grill Jonathan again.
Oh, okay. Well, shoot. Let's see. I've already started talking, so I guess it's my time. Jonathan, how would you explain these where Matthew and well, I'm just going to stick with Matthew. I'm not even going to bring up Luke. Where Matthew corrects some of Mark's Greek. He actually makes it more fluid and more elegant. And he also completely obliterates his I keep forgetting how what they call it. I think it's called myochism. It's a literary element of ABBA that Matthew just totally destroys, that Mark sets up. And in order for Mark to have done this in order for Mark to have done this, it would have had to have been written first, because there's no way that it could have been written using the literary element it was written in, having been written from Matthew, without completely losing everything. So we know this isn't just some condensation of story. So how would you explain those changes?
Well, it's really dependent on their evolutionary that Mark came first. We do see differences, but these differences actually testify to their independence. We know both Mark had Peter as his source, and Matthew knew Peter, which explains the similarities. And as far as their differences in writing styles, we know there were scribes. Mark was the scribe of Peter, according to the historical documents. and Matthew was a publican or tax collector. So obviously, in that capacity, working for the Romans, he would have had to keep notes and records. So when we look at those differences, I just don't see how we can equate that to determining, because upon whose eyes do we look at to determine, because we're talking about formation of text, it's a publication.
Sure.
So how do I determine historically, based on internal documents, which came first or not?
So if we're looking at two renditions of the same story, of the same narrative, say we take Swiss Family Robinson, and we take one copy that's earlier than another, and we look at it. We might notice that from the first copy that some things had been changed, some grammatical errors were fixed, or maybe some things were added to better explain the story. You wouldn't see it the other way around. You wouldn't see a story being corrected wrong, if that makes any sense. You wouldn't see anybody injecting an error where there is no error, because it's going out of your way to make a grammatical error. So I mean, how can you justify an error coming after the fact instead of before? Well, wouldn't it make much more sense for somebody to be correcting an error than to be adding one?
Well, it depends, but we need the available copies. Now, we don't have the originals of any of these documents.
Sure, but like for instance, Mark 10:20, it uses philaxamine, where in Matthew 19:20 it uses the correct term ephylaxa. And you see that all throughout the Gospels, but especially you see them between Matthew and Mark, and you see Matthew correcting Mark. You don't see Mark correcting Matthew.
And we have 1 minute.
Oh, okay. Once again, it relies a great deal on subjectivity, because these theories are still based on an evolutionary. I still have to refer back to empirical data of definitive statements from actual fathers that said Matthew came first.
Yes, the Matthew, the book that was written in the language of the Hebrews, was written first.
Well, I mean, we have copies in Aramaic, so we can...
Yes, we have copies in Aramaic, but when we read those, they read as a Greek translation into Aramaic, not the other way around.
Well, yeah, from the but they all said Matthew was first.
But if the text already existed in Aramaic, then why would the Aramaic language, the Aramaic scribes, be translating a Greek document instead of the original Aramaic?
Well, we don't have the original, so that's why we can't.
But they did. So you're saying at either one point that the Aramaic version was lost, and that all that the Aramaic scribes had to copy from was the Greek translation.
I still don't see how that would provide definitive evidence to support that Mark was first.
I personally find it compelling, but that's fine.
So, James, I'm not sure where you want to go from here, but...
You got it. Thank you, Siv. I think we got everything fixed up, so... Whew. All right. Very excited to move into the Q&A. So, at this point, we'll have 30 minutes of question and answer. And so, I'm going to shoot these over to Siv, and her and I will switch off in reading these. And the first one, just want to say thank you so much, 0132 for your super chat. Totally appreciated. And also, he had said, no idea why I find this conversation interesting, but I do. So thanks for hosting it. And we totally appreciate that, Zero. All credit to the debaters. It honestly, I am just, every time they're on, I'm like, you guys just bring in primary sources, and you guys, it's like, I feel like people are learning like methods of historicity. So it's really, I completely agree, Zero. This has been a blast. And also, Whistler, That One Gamer, and Native Atheist. Thanks for subbing. We're excited that you're a part of the community, and we hopefully you'll see you again. So, and hopefully we'll get to have you get to see these debaters again, it's been a joy to have them here. So next we will go to the Q&A, and I'm gonna quick read these off, and then I'll shoot them over to Civ while I'm reading off the first one. So let's see. Tom Jump, coming at you. Oh, that's coming at you, Jay Chef. So, Civ, I'm gonna send you this on Twitter because I can't put the questions into the Zoom because I'm using the other laptop to send them over. So, question though from Tom Jump for Jonathan is, I think you may be pronouncing, leave it to Tom to do this. I think you may be pronouncing Herodotus incorrectly. Shouldn't it be Heroditus, not Herodotus?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, my Greek is actually pretty bad. I don't know how he pronounced his name back in the 5th century BC, so I couldn't hear it. But I'm probably pronouncing it pretty bad.
I was going off. I would have said I think the same. So thank you, Tom, for correcting us. I just appreciate you so much. So
T-jump for the win. Oh, and also. Irenaeus is another one of my pet peeves. I don't know. That's just
it's a Greek name, and
right.
Think about it. It's like, how do you? I mean, because we weren't there, so we don't know how they sounded, but we get a feel for it. But yeah, I'm very bad with crucifying names.
Yeah, crucifying names. I like that.
You're in good company. Me too. It's one of my specialties. So
as long as you fix it in 3 days, it's fine.
Sivcat, you've got the next one if those messages came through.
They did, but if I go to Twitter, it might mess up the format.
Oh, you know what? I know what to do. Don't worry. I'm going to put it into Zoom. I found a way. But I'll ask the next one, and we'll have more questions coming in. If anybody who has a question, put at Modern Day Debate into the live chat. We will scoop it out and ask them. So, Iron Charioteer asks, so for Jonathan, ask what he thinks of the secret gospel of Mark, where Jesus raised him from the dead and spent the night with him without his loincloths.
Well, we're aware of a lot of textual traditions that were composed outside the official churches. Irenaeus gives an account of many apocryphal gospels that were produced by a number of various sects. So when we look at these ancient accounts, such as the secret Gospel of Mark, the story of Jesus as a child, when we investigate the independent churches, these churches that do trace back, they only come up with basically this version of Mark, not these additional stories that we know were rampant throughout the ancient world.
Well, and I would also like to add to that it does come from a letter that's attributed to Clement of Alexandria, so I will put that there.
Yeah, okay. Clement was kind of heretical. But, the thing about it is it's never dependent on one person as far as the document. What we want to see with the documents is that independent streams throughout churches that can trace back coming up with the same testimony. Any one church or father can forge text, come up with something new, but how do you get it into all the other independent churches? Marcion had this problem in his 2nd century edition. The Gospel of Truth by the Valentians had the same issue. You can publish an account and you can pawn it off as a writing of the apostles, but how do you get them into all the churches and accepted by those groups?
Right, exactly. You definitely have to get it in there early.
Yeah.
All right, so are y'all ready for the next questions?
Uh-huh.
Yep.
Okay, this is from Pelagia, and it says, question for both. What kind of evidence would you need to lower the confidence in your position?
Oh, that's a good question. Jonathan, you want to go first?
Yeah, to lower confidence, I think first, if there was disagreement between the testimony throughout the independent center. So if someone said John was first, Luke was first, Mark was first. So if you saw within the epicenters of Christianity these differences, similar to what you saw with the Gnostic textual traditions, it would lower my confidence overall, because what we see is disagreement and no uniformity of testimony coming from independent centers. So that would probably lower. Or if there was a council that said, well, here as it is written, from today moving forward, Matthew is going to be considered first. That was published. So if we had historical documentation, I wouldn't be the one that would say I'm not going to listen to it. There's a lot of stuff that we have to deal with as Christians, from textual variants, differences between the Greek, the Latin, and the Aramaic text that I have to deal with. But I don't see it on this particular issue, and that's why I come to a conclusion I do. That hand it over to Jim.
I would say that if we had evidence for a Hebrew or an Aramaic autograph, that would greatly reduce my doubt, my skepticism as to this is the document that the early church fathers are referencing. Or even if Papias was just to say that it was written in Greek, and that it even if he was just to omit the part that it was written in the language of the Hebrew, like that, he did himself and the rest of Christianity a great injustice in adding that one little descriptive detail. I guess that would be most convincing for me, would just to be having evidence of an original autograph in Aramaic or Hebrew.
All right, anything else? Are y'all ready for the next question?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
All right, this is also from Pelagia. It says, question for John. If Matthew was written in Aramaic, how did the author make the mistake of thinking Zech 99 wanted 2 donkeys in 21:7?
That's a very good.
Yeah, I think it comes back to I can't read the minds of ancient authors what led them to that situation. So anything that I can offer is only conjecture. There's lots of different things. Why don't the genealogies of Matthew and Mark agree?
But I think what he's getting to, though, is that the reference to the prophecy was written in Hebrew, and so if Matthew was originally written in Hebrew, then why would he get the Hebrew translation wrong?
Well, I think that the way I interpret it, and once again, it's hard to understand what Irenaeus, Pius, and others meant when they written in the language of the Hebrews, because language of the day would have been Aramaic for them.
Aramaic or Hebrew.
Or Hebrew. I mean, we know on the Temple Mount that the synagogues, they were speaking Aramaic.
Sure.
So, it was dominant in that area. So,
right. And Mark does have much more Aramaic references than Matthew does.
Mm-hmm. Peter was Jewish.
Yeah, right.
So, as far as understanding, what led him, I really wasn't there, and I can't get into his mind why he or other scholars would make the errors that they do.
You bet. Thank you very much. And I will ask the next one. 0132 has a question for Jonathan. So, if a historical document isn't trustworthy, why should it be held above reasonable inferences based on readings of the Gospels and early manuscripts?
Well, because the question here is a historical one, because we're dealing with the publication of a document that was published in the ancient world. So it's not a theological question. It's a question of what can history tell us. And if we're doing an historical investigation, we need to go to the writings and the documents. So when we have definitive statements made across a wide geographical landscape, why would we base our conclusions on conjecture when we have empirical data that shows the otherwise? So it really goes back to the question, why would I reject empirical documentation for speculation? I mean,
Yeah.
in a court of law, you know, where you have witnesses that come to basically the same testimony, are we going to support a theory proposed by the prosecution that can't be substantiated at the crime scene? Does that make sense?
You betcha. Thank you very much. Or are you talking to me or to Jim? Sorry.
Oh, no, to whoever the
speaker? You bet.
Yeah.
You betcha. Thank you very much, Jonathan. And thank you again, Zero, for that question. And that one gamer has a question. Jonathan, you're getting so much attention tonight. They just can't get enough of you.
Jim, you need to become a Christian for a show.
I'm telling you, man, I'm jealous.
It's that one gamer asks, what would, in your opinion, be the strongest evidence that Matthew predated Mark? So if you have to kind of zero in on just one. And he said he came in late, so he's kind of, I think he's kind of hoping for that. Namely, like if you picked the very strongest.
The very strongest, and remember, it's the weight of the evidence. So I'm actually looking at the testimony of Irenaeus from an epicenter of Christianity that is known to John, which goes back to source, and that his testimony is corroborated by Origen in Alexandria, another C, Clement of Alexandria, Jerome, Augustine, Athanasius. So the culmination of multiple independent testimony is what drives my decision. So that's the empirical data.
You betcha. Thank you very much, Jonathan. And Sig will read the next question that I just shot into the Zoom chat. But in the meantime, I want to say thank you for your questions, everybody. These are actually, it's just really fun to get to hear people's perspectives. And I'm like so encouraged that people, like, they're totally digging this, because it's like just an issue. Basically, one of the reasons why I love this channel and why I kind of do it is to find other weird people like me, and I mean that in a good way. Sometimes people are like, oh no, don't be hard on yourself. And it's like, no, this is like people like us. I think we're cool. So the point is, I just love that we have people that just love ideas so much. People that
I think it's great, James, that we've elevated ourselves, both theist and non-theist, from the whole and nuh-uh thing, and my God can beat up your not God thing. You know, I think it's great that the arguments have elevated to a more intellectual level.
Yeah,
And I think Jim is right on this, because I think, you know, I'm speaking as a Christian. I think in many ways when we meet with those outside of our circles, we really don't come with an intellectual argument. And I think, you know, since the time of the Enlightenment, I feel this is where the downfall of Christianity has been, is that we've lost the intellectual argument. This is no longer the Christianity of Augustine or Tertullian or Athanasius. It's really succeeded more to the modern day church. And I don't know if you can give a little more perspective on that, Jim, but, you know, from your dealings with other Christians.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, and for so long, the arguments have been about what's on the pages and not what's in the pages. And I think there's a great distinction to be made there.
Really interesting. Good to hear from you guys on that. And go ahead, Sib, didn't mean to interrupt you.
Okay, so this is from Richard Madsen. The promises of God to Christ are being enjoyed by 24 elders, making them all Christs from earth. Could 4 Gospels be 4 different Christs through history of the universe?
Who's that to?
It does not specify.
I'm going to say no, just because they are so very similar, and that so much of it is from the exact same account. And so no, I don't think that it's possible at all, unless you are saying that some of the things, like for instance, the things that Matthew and Luke agree on that don't exist in Mark. Maybe you're saying that the hypothetical Q source or another source is just references to another deity.
Read the question one more time, Sid.
The promises of God to Christ are being enjoyed by 24 elders, making them all Christs from earths. Could 4 Gospels be 4 different Christs through the history of the universe?
It seems like a numerology argument. I know first and second centuries, that was a legal argument employed in the Greek and Latin schools. Irenaeus kind of uses it in trying to understand why there's only 4 Gospels in his writings. But yeah, I would probably say no. I think it reflects on the testimony of one with 4 independent witnesses from 4 different vantage points. And their differences are a testament to the testimony that's declared in its books. Hopefully that answers that.
Thank you very much for that. And we'll do a last call. Sorry, I was distracted. Ocean wanted his precious wrench. So basically, if anybody has any more questions, we'll take them. But in the meantime, we will just maybe do some closing points. So one thing is just a reminder to the moderators, if you're willing to, by the way, I actually like people's feedback on this, both the debaters and CivCat and people in the live chat. I had criticism the other day, and I don't mind. Like, I'm happy to have criticism. It doesn't bother me. But I was like, well, okay, let's consider your idea. They said, your mods are like having opinions in the chat, and I was like, I don't really care if they do. I don't want them to mute anybody for no good reason. John, I hate to call you out, buddy, but yeah, you might have accidentally hit the wrong message. You erased Saint Dragon's message where he just said hello to what do you meme. My hope is you probably just, I think you just missed you maybe meant to delete a different message, but obviously saying hello to somebody in the live chat is not, it's not against the rules. So, but the point is, so let's say theoretically John Peterson, if he's if he shares an opinion, or if HistoryNet shares an opinion, I think actually it was HistoryNet they were getting mad at, is should moderators be able to share opinions if they have a wrench? I think yes. That seems customary, right? I mean, but I'm willing to take a different opinion. Sorry, I clearly just already gave mine, but I want to hear others. You guys agree or disagree?
I mean, I don't know. I think that just a mix of people is always a good thing. Diversity is always a plus.
Yeah, I feel like the same thing. Jonathan, did you have a point or idea too?
No, I'm sorry, cat is all over the place. Um, I'm for freedom of expression and having different viewpoints in there. So,
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Siv. Sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna say that I'm with John and Jim, and as long as people are, being responsible with what they've got, then I think it makes sense to be able to share their opinions.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking. Everybody's a critic out there, but basically, I think we'll just keep doing that. Mods can share their opinions all they want, and Brian Stevens made a good point. Like, the only thing that we kind of want to kick out is like the kind of sexism, racism, all the isms of picking on people. That I agree with. And John Peterson, I agree, if somebody uses a homophobic slur, they should get the boot. So we did have a new question in the meantime, and thanks for your guys' feedback on that. And as well as everybody in the live chat, it's nice to I kind of want to put you guys in the driver's seat, because a lot of these I'm like, I have no idea. But the question was from Iron Charioteer. He said, not sure if this is relevant, but ask Jonathan who recorded Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane.
When he was praying by himself and nobody was there, or they're supposed to be sleeping.
who recorded him? Well, I mean, who recorded him? Well, once again, I think that we don't know what side conversations happened, but Matthew and John were both eyewitnesses as far as getting that relevant information. They were with Jesus, so I'm not sure why couldn't it be shared. So we have two independent ones that were with Jesus. So along with Peter.
Jesus would have to disclose a moment that really humanized him and really where he was broken down and really showed his most vulnerable self. Something that he had to say that Jesus shared this with his disciples whenever he obviously didn't want them hearing it in the first place.
Gotcha. Thank you very much.
Nicely done, Jim.
Interesting stuff. So, let's see. Oh, this is another one. So, Chester Copperbottom, thanks for this question. He says...
Chester Copperbottom, yeah.
The Goonies, right?
Yeah, that's what's up.
Chester Copperpot.
So I'm trying to remember that. I'm a huge Goonies fan.
Oh, man, that's classic right there.
Yeah, that's great.
So, okay. So basically, yes. Why didn't each apostle have their own gospel? That might be a meaningless question, but both can answer if they would like to. Yeah, that's a fair question. I like that.
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting because we actually only have two of the writers, that being John and Matthew, who are apostles of Christ, and Luke being the follower of Paul, his scribe, and also Mark. It's quite interesting that we only had two apostles actually record events from our documents and two followers, which is I think it's quite interesting because you would, if you look at the textual landscape, you would have thought all of them wrote with the Gospel of Peter and the Gospel of Thomas, but we only had two. Not sure why, but this is what has come down. Naturally, you would think there'd be many more publications with a large group of followers of Christ, but these were the ones that came down.
Well, the ones that were accepted anyways.
You betcha. So with that, we actually have gone through the questions, and I want to say thank you to the debaters. This is honestly always a pleasure, and it's just yeah. I honestly, I always. So can I tell you guys a story? So really quick, just about how much I enjoy these debates. One time I went, so I like to sell plasma. It's like a hobby. Basically, while I was selling my bodily fluid, I was getting ready, and they were like, let us, they do the normal thing of like taking your blood pressure and all that. And they were like, so this is like right after I got done with the show, I drove over there, and they're like, your pulse is like 101, so it's like pretty high. And I was just so stoked from the stream that I get amped from these, such that if you tested my pulse right now, so basically they made me wait in the lobby because my pulse was too high. So they're like, you have to go wait in the lobby, and they're like, we can try it again in a little bit, but for some reason right now your pulse is really high. And I had just driven over, so I didn't ride my bike or anything, and I was like, yeah, it's like I just did a stream on Modern Day Debate. So
I think there's a lot of interest in textual criticism from those, maybe not so much from within, but definitely those outside of Christian circles are very interested in it. And I think it is a fascinating subject because, how do we get the text of the New Testament? I think it's a really interesting discussion, and that's why I, invested time really studying this issue.
Yeah, I think it's a blast, and I think that in psychology, like there's the big five is like a standard view of, or standard fact, or like a model of personality, and one of the big five traits is openness. My guess is that most of the people that are here are high on openness. And openness can be like two different, like there's generally two sub facets. One would be artistic expression. The other one would be like ideas. So if you just love ideas, like some people, they're just like, oh, I just want to think about stuff. Like they love hearing new ideas, like whether it be new theology or new whatever. Like I think a lot of the people here would probably be that way, especially the regulars, because they don't just come to like Christianity versus atheism. They're like, and I also find theology interesting, and I also find this interesting, like whether or not pot should be legalized. Like, got a lot of different people. So
that's what I want to know, is whether openness is an indica or a sativa.
Is that Latin?
Yeah, it's Latin.
It's totally new. I don't believe it or not, Jim. I don't know Latin, so
that's all right.
So basically, we do have one question. We're closing the Q&A right now. Sorry about that, but I just want to ask these because we're still like roughly within time. If I can just quick ask these are fun. Another one for Jonathan. It's all the attention. So basically, they said, ask Jonathan, if you have the Holy Spirit in you, can you automatically do miracles?
No. I think Paul talks about the gifts of the Spirit, and each one has accumulation of their own gifts. But no, I would not say that the gift of the Holy Spirit means you can go out there and do miracles.
Gotcha. So, the super interesting question, and thank you for that answer. That was interesting as well. So, trying to just quick read through, I'm like, thank you guys for your feedback also on like how the mod stuff should work. And then I just want to, just in case any of these came in before we close the Q&A. Thank you so much. Okay, that's it. Super awesome questions. The debaters' links are in the description. Highly encourage you check them out. And Civ's Twitter is in the description. Civ, I hate to put you on the spot, but people in the live chat are always like, who's that cutie, Civ Weber? And I'm like, okay. So, yeah, so you've got a lot of fans out there, Civ. The rest of us, we're just squirrels trying to get a nut. And, this is Civ's world. She's getting the most attention in the chat. So, Thank you, Siv, for your help tonight. You honestly totally saved me there because we had another tech issue, and I appreciate you taking the helm. So, excellent, everybody. All right. Any last words from everybody, and then we'll let her say goodnight to everybody.
No, I just want to thank Jonathan for coming on and discussing this with me. As always, had a great discussion, and thank you so much, James and Siv, for moderating this debate and facilitating this discussion. Had a really good time as always, and look forward to the next discussion.
Same here. Thank you. Go ahead, Jonathan.
No, same here. Thanks for Jim coming on. I think it's important for him to share his perspective, especially on a position that many Christians hold. So, because facts do matter, if you do hold those positions, you know, it does mean something. So, I always ask people to go out and research and understand what these things mean if you're going to hold to them. But no, it was great speaking with Jim again. I think I like having these conversations on text-critical issues. I think there's a lot of value from both sides. And it was great meeting you, Siv, and working with you again, James, to have us on the show.
This has been a blast. I couldn't have asked for a better time. So with that, thank you for everybody, the speakers, and our co-mod, Siv, and everybody in the audience. We hope you have a great night. Keep sifting out the reasonable from the unreasonable. Take care.